Boom. And just like that, it is week 5 of the fantasy season. So you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, break down every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting in week 5 of the fantasy season. Right, very quickly here, we have 4 teams on bye week here in week 5 of the season. The Pittsburgh Steelers, so no DK Metcalf. The Chicago Bears, so no Rome Odunze or DJ Moore. The Atlanta Falcons, no Drake London. And the Green Bay Packers, so no Romeo Doubs, Matthew Golden, or whoever else is on that team. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We are going to have the Niners traveling to face the Rams. Let's start with whatever corpses are left of the San Francisco 49ers wide receiver room. Jauan Jennings, questionable going into week 5, as is Ricky Pearsall. Ricky Pearsall believed to have a PCL injury. It is supposedly minor, but I mean, we can't count on either of these guys to be in our starting lineups here in week 5. Jauan Jennings is dealing with an undisclosed injury. So both these guys had to exit in week 4. Jennings came back. Pearsall came back at a point, exited again. It's a different knee than the knee that was injured going into week 4 for Pearsall. I do not know what's in the water in San Francisco, what they are feeding these guys. If Christian McCaffrey's doing some weird voodoo magic so he doesn't get hurt this year, but everybody else does. I don't know what it is, but I'm not relying on any 49ers wide receivers in my starting lineups in week 5 on a short week especially. It's not a bad matchup against the Rams secondary, but still, I don't care who it is here, if it's Kendrick Bourne or somebody else. I'm not risking anybody. They're all sits for me as we approach the week. When it comes to the Rams, it's the complete opposite. Even on a short week here, Puka Nacua, Devontae Adams, absolute must-start wide receivers every single week. Not a great matchup. The Niners are a top 5 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, but come on. Puka Nacua, 36 fantasy points in week 4, the wide receiver 1 in half and full PPR right now. 15 targets, 13 catches, 170 receiving yards. His first receiving touchdown of the season. You got to start these guys no matter what. Adams, 15.6 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 catches, 56 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He's getting a ton of red zone looks, a ton of opportunity. Still getting very good volume, even with Puka Nacua absolutely feasting right now. Tutu Atwell did have that big score, but outside of that, he has 1 catch on the entire season. So we're not considering him. Puka, Adams, very strong starts. Everybody else in this matchup, I'm staying far away from as we approach the week. And I do not see this production for the Rams wide receivers slowing down in any way, shape, or form. So I'm headed straight to Underdog, and I don't care if you take Puka Nacua to score a touchdown or Devontae Adams to score a touchdown. Both these lines are active on Underdog right now. Take one of them. They are both worth the risk here in week 5 of the season. And don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards week 5's NFL action. Take that free Pick'em. Take one of these Rams wide receivers to score a touchdown. And if both of those lines hit, you'll automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog has a new exclusive offer to anyone who signs up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. Once you play through $5 on Underdog, you're automatically going to receive $50 in bonus cash to use towards week 5 NFL action. And on top of that, you're still going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog. So make sure you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH if you want to take advantage of all of Underdog's week 5 exclusive offers. Moving into Sunday's action, we're going to get another early game matchup in London between the Vikings and the Browns. Justin Jefferson, 22.6 fantasy points in week 4, 11 targets, 10 catches, 126 receiving yards. Did most of his damage in the first half of the game, but it was at least nice to see Carson Wentz get going in some sense in this week 4 matchup, even though it started out very rough for Wentz. And we might see J.J. McCarthy back this week. I don't know what's going to happen with the Vikings quarterback situation, but I truly think in week 5, no matter what, it's going to be Carson Wentz as the team is still overseas, and then they get a bye week in week 6, and maybe it changes. But I don't really care. Justin Jefferson is still a strong start no matter what. The nice thing here is Jordan Addison in his first game back was productive. We had him as a flex last week. I think he's a flex once again here against the Browns in week 5. 8 targets, 4 catches, had that one big catch, 114 receiving yards, 15.4 fantasy points. This Browns defense is middle of the pack against wide receivers, much better against the run than the wide receiver position in terms of fantasy points allowed. So if you own Addison, I think he's flexible this week. Don't forget, this is like closer to a home matchup for the Vikings than it is the Browns, because the Vikings don't have to travel nearly as far as the Browns will be doing this week. So I think JJ remains a solid start as we had him last week, and Addison a good flex as we had him last week. When it comes to the Browns wide receivers, I have no interest in starting any of these guys. The Vikings have been very good against opposing wide receivers. Jerry Jeudy, 7.8 fantasy points this past week. Cedric Tillman, 1.6. He's hurt with a hamstring injury. Isaiah Bond showed up. Maybe pay attention to that. I guess he's 2% rostered, 8.8 fantasy points. Maybe with no Tillman, he gets more volume, but come on. In this matchup, traveling overseas, Joe Flacco, a quarterback, I want nothing whatsoever to do with the Browns wide receivers in week 5. Moving into Sunday's action in the early window, we're going to start with the Cowboys traveling to face the Jets. George Pickens, a big week 4 performance on Sunday Night Football. 33.4 fantasy points with no CeeDee Lamb in the lineup. 11 targets, 8 catches, 134 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. And don't forget, he had a touchdown in both of the previous games, one with CeeDee Lamb, one with basically no CeeDee Lamb. So he has still been producing on a consistent basis for 3 weeks straight. I know it's a tough matchup against the Jets. He's going to see Sauce Gardner in this game, undoubtedly. Like, the Jets defense not ranking well against opposing wide receivers, but we still have to look out for wide receiver ones on this team who will be shadowed by Sauce Gardner. So maybe, the ceiling will be lower than what we saw last week, but still, Pickens going to be a tough player to bench, especially with a couple bye week teams this week. So Pickens, just keep rolling with them. Jalen Tolbert is like a risky flex if you guys are desperate. I have him as a sit. I don't think you guys need to go out of your way to start him, but 6 targets, 4 catches, 61 receiving yards, 10.1 fantasy points. He was the next beneficiary of there being no CeeDee Lamb in week 4. Now, I am recording this, assuming that CeeDee Lamb is not going to play in week 5. Obviously, if that changes, we'll talk about it in the comments down below, but I don't think he's going to be able to go in week 5. Kevontae Turpin had 6.4 fantasy points. Tolbert, a risky flex if CeeDee Lamb doesn't play this week and you guys are desperate. But for the most part, it's just Pickens and nobody else. Now, full disclosure, I have to record these videos before Monday Night Football has been played, as most of you guys know, on a week-to-week basis. So if something happens with Garrett Wilson, injury, anything that changes my mind here, we'll talk about it in the comments down below. But he's getting the Cowboys this week. They've given up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers so far on the year. So I'm just going to go in and say, no matter what happens in Monday Night Football against the Dolphins, which is a very strong spot for Garrett Wilson, who I like a lot going into week 4, I think I'm going to like him a lot again at home against the Cowboys in week 5. Moving along, we have the Giants traveling to face the Saints. And let's just take a moment of silence, everybody. Let's pour one out for Malik Neighbors, who is out on the rest of the season. And let's take a look at these Giants wide receivers and what we're going to be left with, okay? This is a good matchup this week against the Saints. This has not been a strong unit against the wide receiver position so far on the year. We know Neighbors has a torn ACL. He will miss the rest of the year. So Wan'Dale Robinson, Darius Slayton are the next men up. I think Robinson is a risky flex due to the matchup here. He's been very unproductive the last 2 weeks, right? Darius Slayton hasn't been productive this year. Slayton had 4 targets this past week. Robinson had 5 targets. And this offense is very interesting with Jackson Dart because, Dart's going to run a little bit more. He is dealing with a hamstring issue, so bear that in mind. Don't forget Russell Wilson had to come into the game for a very, very short period of time, was on the field for 3% of snaps in week 4. Then, they're relying a little bit more on Cam Scatterbo, and they're getting the run game going. Theo Johnson at the tight end position had a good week this past week. So we're kind of in this weird area, like trying to figure out this offense under Jackson Dart, who he's going to depend on the most, all of those things. But somebody can show up here. It's a good matchup against the Saints. If it wasn't a good matchup, I'd probably just sit back and say no thank you at all. But once again, teams are on bye week. The matchup's here. you could risk one of these guys, but it's very, very risky. And keep an eye on Jackson Dart's status as the week progresses. Then we look at the Saints side of things. Chris Olave just remains a low-end start on a weekly basis. He has 10 or more fantasy points every game this year, but like he just scored his first touchdown of the year in week 4, and he only got you 10 fantasy points. So low-end start, there's a floor. What is the real upside? Not sure, but this is a great matchup against the Giants. So he's a good start this week. Rashid Shaheed, just a risky flex, will probably get you 8-ish points, or on a good day, if he scores, will get you like 15 to 16 points. It is a good matchup. This could be a good spot for Rashid Shaheed if you guys are desperate due to bye weeks. Anybody else here, just not going to be in consideration when it comes to fantasy. So interesting matchup here. We'll see what happens in week 5. Next up, we will have the Raiders traveling to face the Colts. Let's start with the Raiders side of things. I was really disappointed in Jacoby Myers in week 4. A great matchup. Had a good matchup in week 3. Just hasn't been producing. 7 targets against the Bears in week 4 at home. Just 4 catches, 30 receiving yards, 7 fantasy points. I don't know why Myers can't seem to get it going after he was pretty solid in the first 2 weeks of the season. And like, there wasn't any real production in terms of the receiving game anywhere else on this team, even at the tight end position with Brock Bowers. So I don't really know what to say about this one. It was a smash spot. It was a good game script. Ashton Genty, the run game just absolutely took over. So I don't give up full faith here. I'm not going to sneeze at this Colts defense necessarily. They haven't been good against the pass. That is for sure. They are bottom 5, but they've still shown up at times. And Geno Smith, his volatile quarterback play does worry me. But with all that being said, due to the matchup, Myers is still in flex consideration, but the floor is feeling very unstable. And then Trey Tucker is still in the risky flex category as he is double digits in 2 out of 4 games this year. And it's a good matchup. We'll leave it at that. There's bye weeks. I know if you've spent a lot of fab on Trey Tucker, you're not feeling good after week 4, but he could bounce back this week and give you some production in this matchup. All right. Next up, we have the Colts, and Michael Pittman just remains a start. Like, yeah, he got the Pat Surtain treatment in week 2, didn't show up. Outside of that, he's had 15.1 or more fantasy points in every game thus far on the year, and the Raiders are also a bottom 5 team against the wide receiver position in terms of fantasy points allowed. So Pittman, you keep rolling with him. A touchdown in 3 of the first 4 games of the year. He's a strong start, absolute must-start player in my mind, honestly. Anybody else here? Josh Downs, Alec Pierce, if he's healthy. A.D. Mitchell, who I don't know if A.D. Mitchell is going to get a lot of volume after some of his play in week 4, although he did have 10.6 fantasy points. I just can't trust the rest of these Colts wide receivers. It's Pittman. It's the run game with JT. It's a little bit of involvement with Daniel Jones, although he didn't do anything on the ground this past week. But ultimately, it's just Pittman. That's the only player I can really trust outside of Jonathan Taylor in this offense. And Tyler Warren at the tight end position, he's probably more notable than some of these other guys at the wide receiver position for sure. But yeah, I can't trust Josh Downs. Can't trust A.D. Mitchell after this past week. Don't know if Alec Pierce is going to play this week. So just roll with Pittman, and that's it for the Colts wide receivers. Next up, we have the Dolphins traveling to face the Panthers. And I am recording this, like I said before, Monday Night Football. So if anything crazy happens, any injuries, any outstanding performances against the Jets in week 4, then I'll have a pinned comment down below if my mind has changed here. We know Sauce Gardner is probably going to face Tyreek Hill in week 4, so we'll see how it shakes out. Could benefit Waddle more than Hill, obviously, but I still think, both these guys were low-end starts in week 4. I think they'll be low-end starts once again on the road in week 5 against the Panthers. Panthers are a weird team right now, but they've given up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers thus far on the season. So, on the road, tough matchup. Like Hill, Waddle are going to be startable in PPR, especially on a weekly basis. The ceiling can be limited at times, but once again, probably going to have to see how Monday Night Football goes before I have a clear answer. But I think they're both startable. Undoubtedly, they've had enough production through the first 3 weeks of the season to go ahead and roll with them, regardless of what happens on Monday Night Football. Then we get T-Mac, the only wide receiver we really need to talk about for the Panthers. The Dolphins, surprisingly, have been pretty good against opposing wide receivers, as bad as this defense has been, it feels like, on a weekly basis. But yeah, I mean, T-Mac just remains a low-end start. 10 fantasy points in week 4, 8 targets, 4 catches, 62 receiving yards. He still has double digits in 3 out of 4 games on the season so far. He's just missing a ceiling with the way that this offense is playing on a week-to-week basis. We've seen Bryce Young only throw for more than 154 yards in 1 game this year. So startable, it's just like, once again, what is the real ceiling here? It may take some time for this to really get going in terms of T-Mac's overall production and fantasy. Hunter Renfrow, Xavier Legette, who didn't play this past week, and we'll see what happens with Xavier Legette overall. But yeah, none of these guys are going to be anything that we can consider. Keep an eye on Jalen Coker. Is getting closer to a potential return from IR in that quad injury. I think Jalen Coker will have a solid role. He's sitting around 14% rostered. Even if you have to throw him on your IR for another week or two, Jalen Coker, a player I want you guys to pay close attention to, because this Panthers wide receiver room really needs somebody else to step up. Next up, we will have the Broncos traveling to face the Eagles. Should be one of the better matchups of the week. Let's start with the Broncos side of things. Yeah, unfortunate here that I have to record this before Monday Night Football. It's not the worst matchup. I mean, the Eagles are kind of middle of the pack against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. Could be a tough spot for Courtland Sutton, who's mostly been very productive on the season. I'm expecting him to have a good week against the Bengals in week 4. Maybe, his production leads to other guys being productive in week 4, and he doesn't need to do a lot in what I'm assuming is going to be mostly a one-sided matchup. We'll find out, but yeah, I think you got to keep rolling with Sutton, even if he sees a lot of Quinion Mitchell in this week 5 matchup. And this is kind of how I feel about this wide receiver room on a weekly basis. I just don't trust Troy Franklin or Marvin Mims or anybody else who's left over here. But ultimately, maybe they show up against the Bengals. I don't know that I would have the most confidence that they're going to show up against the Eagles. So for me, it's really just Courtland Sutton, and that's it in week 5 of the season. A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, I mean, I don't want to be too dramatic here, but I just don't love this matchup against a top 12 unit, against a wide receiver position in the Broncos. We're probably going to see Pat Surtain mostly on A.J. Brown, and historically, I don't really start even true wide receiver ones against Pat Surtain unless they're like a top 5 player, right? And Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown, after absolutely having great weeks in week 3, combined for less than 8 fantasy points this past week and combined for 4 total catches. So their flex options, they're boomer bust. They are the literal definition of boomer bust. And I don't want you guys to completely give up here on either A.J. Brown or Devonta Smith. But in terms of calling their production, it's probably going to be mostly matchup based. And this just isn't the best matchup for either of these wide receivers in week 5. Final game of the early window will be the Texans traveling to face the Ravens. Let's start with the Texans side of things. Nico Collins, 11.9 fantasy points in week 4, 6 targets, 4 catches, 79 receiving yards. In my eyes, he's the only startable Texans wide receiver right now. Great matchup against the Ravens. This is a bottom 5 unit against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. You got to like him this week. You got to keep rolling with him. He's the only true receiving threat on this team, it feels like, maybe outside of Woody Marks at the running back position. Christian Kirk, 4 targets this past week after having 8 targets in week 3. Maybe if you're desperate due to the matchup, maybe, bye weeks, I get it. But yeah, I just don't trust any other Texans wide receiver. And I'm going to leave it at that. I have Zay Flowers kind of downgraded to a low-end start, as he's more than likely going to see Derek Stingley this week, which doesn't make me feel great. But maybe the way these Ravens wide receivers line up, we see Stingley on D-Hop or something. I don't quite know. But then also we got Lamar Jackson, kind of questionable going into the week. We could see Cooper Rush here in week 5. The Ravens do have a bye week in week 7. So I think that could play in to the potential status of Lamar Jackson over the next 2 weeks and the potential for him to get some rest. But at the same time, the Ravens have only won 1 game this year, so there's a strong chance that Lamar Jackson plays this week or is pushed to play over the next 2 weeks. So we'll see what happens, but obviously that's going to impact Zay Flowers. Like I said, not the best matchup for Flowers regardless. Whether he gets Stingley or not, this is still a top 10 unit against opposing wide receivers, but he's a low-end start as he has 14 or more fantasy points in 3 out of 4 games on the year. Any other wide receiver here, I want nothing to do with this Ravens wide receiver room whatsoever unless the name is Zay Flowers as we get ready for the weekend. All right, first game of the afternoon slate will be the Titans traveling to face the Cardinals. Oh, goodness gracious. This Titans passing attack is just bad. We have one game this year where Cam Ward has thrown for more than 175 passing yards. 2 games where he's thrown for 112 or less. I mean, the Cardinals are a bit banged up defensively. They haven't been great against the wide receiver position. But yeah, I'll call Alec Edelman a risky flex because he has a touchdown in 2 of the first 4 games of the year. I'll call everybody else a sit. We had Kelvin Ridley as a sit last week. He has 8.7 or less fantasy points in every game this year, 5 or less in the last 2 games. Just 3 targets, 2 catches this past week as he saw the Texans' #1 corner and Derek Stingley. I'm just staying far away from this Titans wide receiver room, but I know it's a tough week, bye weeks, whatever. Malik Neighbors down. Alec Edelman, a risky flex. Can't call him anything more than that after an unproductive week this past week. Marvin Harrison Jr. had a productive week in week 4. We had downgraded him to a flex option last week. We didn't lose all faith. I think he's solid enough here in this week 5 matchup against the Tennessee Titans. You got to like the matchup. This is a bottom 10 unit against opposing wide receivers. I feel like everybody's going to start Marvin Harrison Jr. with confidence this week, and maybe there's still a chance he doesn't show up because that's how it feels like it happens with MH, but 10 targets, 6 catches, found the end zone, 66 receiving yards, 18.6 fantasy points. The Cardinals are at home. The play calling still feels very anemic here, and that upside seems to be missing from this offense. But yeah, I think Marvin Harrison Jr. will still be a solid start due to the matchup and the fact that the Cardinals are at home and that he got that little boost of confidence in week 4. So go ahead and roll with him in week 5. Next up, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers traveling to face the Seattle Seahawks. Interesting matchup here. Let's start with the Buccaneers side of things. We have talked a ton about Emeka Egbuka for 4 weeks straight in the nuclear videos and the buy low videos. We have talked about him being an absolute must start no matter what for 4 weeks straight. 20.1 fantasy points in week 4, 10 targets, 4 catches, and a receiving touchdown. 4 touchdowns through 4 games on the season so far, 12.9 or more fantasy points in every single matchup. Not a great matchup this week against the Seattle Seahawks, top 5 unit against opposing wide receivers. You got to roll with the Emeka Egbuka, though. He's a must-start player, and my mind will not change on that in week 5. Now, the question here, Mike Evans might not play in week 5 as he missed week 4 dealing with that hamstring issue. And then we saw Chris Godwin come back into the mix, who didn't do a whole lot in week 4, but he had 10 targets. And then it's like, well, if Mike Evans plays, what does the target and volume share look like here? It's tough to say. Then Sterling Shepard, the next man up, had just 4 targets this past week. So first of all, if Evans plays, I think you can still flex him. And I think either way, you can still flex Chris Godwin, but the risk association here is high. Emeka Egbuka is a guy that we can have confidence in. The veterans are kind of the ones with the questionable status because Mike Evans is coming off an injury. If he does play, he might not play. Then Godwin wasn't productive last week, but like I said, he did have 10 targets. So there's something there brewing. And I'll just leave it at that. I think they're both risky flexes, and Godwin more of a potential better flex if Mike Evans doesn't play, obviously. But even if he does play, he's still startable in a week with bye weeks and wide receivers going down and all that. But like I said, it is a tough matchup for the Buccaneers wide receivers this week. And on the flip side, it's actually a tough matchup for Jackson Smith and Jigba and the Seattle Seahawks wide receivers, as the Bucs are a top 10 unit against opposing wide receivers. But JSN remains a must-start player no matter what. I know it took some time to get going against the Cardinals in week 4, but he still finished with 5 targets, 4 catches, 79 receiving yards, and 13 fantasy points. He's had 13 or more fantasy points every game this year. Wide receiver 6 in PPR, wide receiver 8 in half PPR. You got to keep rolling with him. He's a must-start wide receiver no matter what. Cooper Kupp, Torrey Horton, I mean, these guys have had the opportunity, the chances, but they have proven to be not even risky flexes for me. I mean, sure, maybe due to bye weeks and everything, you could throw a dart here, but I don't trust either of these guys in my starting lineup. Kupp, 6.6 fantasy points this past week. Horton, 2 fantasy points. Just no thank you. I'm staying away from these other Seattle Seahawks wide receivers in week 5. And along, we have the Lions traveling to face the Bengals. So let's start with the Lions side of things, Amon-Ra St. Brown, absolute must-start player every single week. 26 fantasy points in week 4. 7 catches off of 7 targets, 70 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 10 yards per catch. Start him absolutely no matter what. He gets the Bengals. Listen, like I've said throughout the video, I have to record these before Monday Night Football, but I'm going to continue to assume this matchup against the Bengals is a very good matchup at the end of the day. So keep rolling with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Jameson Williams stays in the flex area. Probably should really downgrade him to a risky flex, but I like the matchup here on the road against the Bengals. It's a good spot for the Lions, who are going to continue to try and be racking up points against opposing defenses. So risky flex, in all honesty, as he's had 6.6 or less fantasy points in 3 out of 4 games on the year. And I mean, had that nice game against the Bears, but only had 2 catches in that game. So, you know what? Jameson Williams is a risky flex, but the matchup's there. Now, like I said, I'm recording this before Monday Night Football. So if my thoughts change here on the Bengals wide receivers, it'll be in a pinned comment down below. But I'm still just considering them flex options as we move into the week. The Lions have not been bad against opposing wide receivers this year. The defense has looked really good, at least in the last week or so. And then it's just tough because, once again, Monday Night Football has not been played. And I have Chase and Higgins as flex options going into Monday Night Football against a good Broncos secondary and Pat Surtain and all that. So we'll see what happens. We need to see how Jake Browning looks, all of that stuff. So I'm just going to leave them as flex options, and maybe Higgins is closer to like the risky flex area based on his Monday Night Football performance. Chase is the wide receiver I would rather risk here. And I mean, come on, how are you going to sit Jamar Chase? It's a tough spot. The Joe Burrow injury absolutely hurts this team. We'll see how things go in week 5. All right, moving along, we have the Commanders traveling to face the Chargers. Let's go ahead and start with the Commander side of things. And worth noting, Jaden Daniels looking like he has a good shot to play in week 5 in this road matchup. Marcus Mariota filled in very nicely over the last 2 weeks, but I still think ultimately it's got to impact the Commanders wide receivers positively if JD5 is playing over Mariota, so bear that in mind. Deebo Samuel, 20 fantasy points in week 4, 6 targets, 6 catches, 72 receiving yards, found the end zone. He's been a very solid start, at least in 3 of the first 4 matchups on the season. A little bit of a tough matchup here against the Chargers, top 5 against opposing wide receivers, but I think if you own Deebo, he's a great start. I got him as like a low-end start still due to the matchup, but I still think he's a very solid start at the end of the day. Scary Terry, if you guys don't know, I mean, I put an asterisk next to players who are going to be questionable going into the week, but I think there's a strong chance we hear sooner rather than later that McLaurin's not going to be ready to go in week 5, especially when like we get 2 really easy matchups in week 6 and 7 against the Bears and Cowboys. Like, I don't think they're going to risk Terry McLaurin on the road here in week 5. And there's still like a chance that Terry McLaurin hits IR with that quad injury. So, I'm just going to stay away from Terry McLaurin unless I'm desperate. I think he's no more than a risky flex here in week 5, but he's still startable as long as he plays. Luke McCaffrey is interesting and really a risky flex if McLaurin's out. I think you could roll with them, but just bear in mind, I mean, I think McCaffrey's worth rostering due to the situation, but he only has 5 catches, I mean, really 6 catches on the entire season. So bear that in mind, 5 catches in the last 2 games where he gave you some production. Just 2 of those catches went for touchdowns. So for a majority of guys, I still think McCaffrey is too risky to start. Worth picking up, see how things go, but I just don't want to start him. I think it's too risky. The volume's been really, really low. We'll see how it plays out. Now, let's go to the Chargers, okay? Let's start with Ladd McConkey because I'm moving him down to the risky flex area. I mean, it was there week 4. The matchup was there. The game script was there. The production for Ladd McConkey was not there, and I left him as a startable player last week because I felt like the matchup was there, and maybe this was the week we would finally see some production out of Ladd. And he had his worst game of the season, 2.1 fantasy points, 6 targets, a catch, 11 receiving yards. Doesn't seem to be on the same page as Justin Herbert. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm just staying away from Ladd McConkey outside of a potential flex option. Getting close to the bench area, but I know we got bye weeks and stuff going on. I mean, it's just tough. Let me know if you guys are Ladd McConkey owners. I think most of you guys in the comments would probably say, you're benching him in week 5, and I think that is acceptable as well. I know Keenan Allen didn't quite get it done in week 4, missed the touchdown. I've kind of been worried about like what happens when Keenan Allen stops scoring touchdowns. He had 8.7 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 catches, 37 receiving yards. But bear in mind, with all this being said, the Commanders have been a bottom 10 unit against opposing wide receivers nearly all season long. So I think Keenan Allen's still startable for sure, but Quentin Johnston seems to be the wide receiver that we want to start here. 23.8 fantasy points in week 4, found the end zone, has 4 touchdowns through the first 4 games of the season, 13 targets, 8 catches, 98 receiving yards. Solid start. I mean, you can't bench Quentin Johnston at this point. He's the wide receiver 4 in full and half PPR. Keep rolling with him here in week 5. Except we have Sunday Night Football, be the Patriots traveling to face the Bills. Let's start with the Patriots side of things. Stephon Diggs, a nice game in week 4. 7 targets, 6 catches, 101 receiving yards, and 16.1 fantasy points. I'm going to go ahead and move him up to a low-end start this week. Plus, with all the bye weeks and everything, like I think he's probably in that area. But the Bills have been pretty good against opposing wide receivers, top 10 against the position. Patriots are on the road, so just bear in mind that there is some risk still associated here. We've seen 2 games with 7 or less fantasy points for Diggs on the year, 2 games with 11 or more fantasy points. We're somewhere in the middle there here in week 5, but Demario Douglas was only on the field for 16% of snaps this past week. Kyle Williams was on the field for 29% of snaps, and Kayshon Boutte only had 3 targets on the field for 69% of snaps. So it's Diggs as the wide receiver 1 here, but you still just can't feel great about this offense at the end of the day in terms of the production they're going to give you from the wide receiver position. Then we look to the Bills. I think Khalil Shakir still remains a very solid start, kind of a lower end start because you do see some lower floors and ceilings for him, but he scored a touchdown in the last 2 games, 17.9 fantasy points against the Saints this past week, and I'm not particularly scared about this bottom 12 unit in the Patriots in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So Khalil Shakir, the ceiling might be missing, but he's a solid start and coming off of his most productive game yet. Then any other Bills wide receiver, I mean, Keon Coleman is nothing more than a risky flex. I know week 1 looked good, but he's had 7.5 or less fantasy points in every game since. But I do think it's a good enough matchup, bye weeks, all that stuff, that if you need to throw a dart at the wall, Keon Coleman is at least a risky flex here in week 5. Josh Palmer has done nothing outside of week 1 on the season, so he's just going to be a sit for me here in week 5. All right, to wrap it up, we have the Chiefs traveling to face the Jaguars on Monday Night Football. Let's start with the Chiefs side of things. Xavier Worthy came back to action in week 4 as he's been dealing with that shoulder injury, and he looked perfectly fine. 8 targets, 5 catches, 83 receiving yards, and 17.1 fantasy points. But it's worth noting against the Ravens defense, who's given up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, all the Chiefs wide receivers showed up this past week. Hollywood Brown had 12.8 fantasy points. Juju Smith-Schuster had a touchdown and 13.6 fantasy points. Tyquan Thornton at least had a touchdown. He's a touchdown in 3 straight games. So I think there's risk associated with all these guys because the volume was really high across the board in week 4. And as I've been saying for the past couple of weeks, this Jaguars defense is not that bad, but they're still bottom 10 against a wide receiver position in terms of fantasy points allowed. So I think all these guys have some sort of startability. I wouldn't risk Juju, but there's still something here across the board. Hollywood Brown also scored this past week. Worthy had enough production that he got you double digits without scoring. But I just don't know what the exact volume is going to look like in week 5. The most startable player here is Xavier Worthy, but we could see some volume spread out across the board. Then we look at the Jaguars. I mean, I think Brian Thomas Jr. could at least be a risky flex. He had 10 fantasy points this past week. I mean, somebody's got to get something going here for the Jaguars wide receivers. It is a tough matchup against a good Chiefs secondary that's top 10 against the position. But if I had to bet against one player on this Jags team or bet on one of them, I guess it would still be Brian Thomas Jr. The volume was much, much better than any other wide receiver on this team in week 4, as we saw Dewami Brown miss the week. Tim Patrick had 1 target. Parker Washington had 2 targets. Travis Hunter had 5 targets. So If I had to risk someone, it would be Brian Thomas, and we'll just have to leave it at that as we wrap up week 5. Here you guys have it, every single matchup, every single wide receiver, and who you should be starting or sitting as we approach week 5 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 5 of the season, please drop me a comment down below. I'll answer as many as I can as the week progresses. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor and helps out the channel substantially if you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. And when the videos, playlists pop up on the screen, make sure you guys are checking out all of our week 5 fantasy content. We're going to have everything that you could possibly need to dominate this week and every week of the fantasy season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.